Once again, welcome to bread making. I am making something that I call politically incorrect bread. It actually has a different name, but it's politically incorrect, so I don't call it that, and I call it politically incorrect bread instead. What this is this is a mixture of rye flour, cornmeal, and wheat flour. The reason that this is interesting is the rye flour has less gluten than wheat flour, and cornmeal has no gluten at all. Now, they both have sugar and carbohydrates in them, so the yeast will act on them, but because there's no gluten, you don't get the web of gluten that will hold the air bubbles in, giving you the light, airy bread that you get with your wheat flour, and it's going to be a thicker, denser bread. Now, adding the wheat flour gives you a significant amount of gluten, and adding a little bit of the rye flour as well helps, but essentially this is going to be a denser bread. If you wanted to, you could just ignore the wheat flour and you'd have something more like a cornbread, a kind of a thicker bread. You'd probably want to use baking soda to leaven it instead of yeast. So what I did was I went with the flour and the yeast so that I could make a bread, but it's going to be a bit thicker, denser bread. This particular loaf is a 50% hydration, and also, as you can tell from the color, it's got 20% molasses in it. So this is going to be a very sweet bread as well, which inhibited the yeast, which is why I let it rise for a couple hours. But rather than punching it down and going through another round of risings, because you have multiple types of flour that's going to give it an interesting taste, and then you've got the molasses, which is probably going to be one of the stronger tastes in the bread. So I'm not going to really give it a second rise. This is just straight out single, this is a single rise, and I'm just going to take it and drop it right into my loaf pan. I'm going to squeeze it down a little bit, make sure that it fits in the loaf pan properly. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time punching this down, rising again, etc. It's going to get a bulk ferment, it's going to get punched down a little bit, and then it's going to go into the oven. Again, 35 minutes at 400. Now, with this much molasses or enrichment sugar in it, you probably want to cook at a lower temperature. You might want to consider, if you make this bread, giving it, say, about an hour at 350. With the lower temperature, you're going to get the molasses is going to caramelize a little bit, but it's not going to burn. That's a danger. If I were to cook this at 450 like I would a wheat bread, then that would be, it would turn black on the outside and burn. So what you have is 2 parts wheat flour, 1 part rye flour, 1 part cornmeal. So we've got the wheat flour as the largest constituent so that we can actually make this into a bread. If I was going with, say, 1 part rye, 1 part corn, then I would put this in a pan and cook it like it was a cake. But I didn't, so it's bread. It's very highly enriched, a lot of molasses in it, so you don't want to cook it too high, but 400 for 30 minutes should be okay. It's going to be denser than a typical wheat bread is going to be, because you're just not going to get a good rise because there's not enough gluten to hold the air in. The air will escape, which will prevent it from rising really well. But it will have a lot of interesting taste with the mixture of rye and cornmeal. This is a very old American bread. The cornmeal, that's something that's native to the Americas, and then the rye is native to England. So this particular mixture of rye and cornmeal is something that came from English settlers who settled in the United States, mixed the rye that they were used to with the cornmeal that they got in trade, and they made it into a generally like a cornbread, but you can make it into a bread if you add wheat flour. And again, we've gone with yeast for the fermentation, so let's go ahead and pause here. We'll get this in the oven, and then you can see what it looks like in a little bit. Back soon. Here we are with our bread. 30 minutes or 35 minutes at 300. You can see here had a bit of a crack. It's because I patted it down and didn't give it a chance to prove it or rise again before I put it in the oven. So that's okay. You can't see this obviously, but it's a fairly heavy, dense bread. Oven spring is the technical term. When you put the bread in the oven, the yeast gives off a last little bit of carbon dioxide before you boil it to death, and that's called oven spring. So we did get oven spring, and that's where the proving came. And let's go ahead and cut this loaf and see what we have. So you can see, I don't think I mentioned this, but this is a 50% hydration, but with the amount of enriching you have, that's probably okay. You can see relatively dense bread. Texture-wise, it is cooked all the way through. A little bit sticky from the molasses in it, but that's okay. Overall, very good bread, very tasty. Again, since you did use lower gluten flours in this, you don't want to use as much water because the dough will just start running all over the place without the gluten hold it in shape. It's going to be a denser loaf. You're not going to get as much air in it, but it tastes okay. I actually really do enjoy eating this, so that works out for me. So that's working with some lower gluten flours, and hope you learned something. Thanks.